Western media has repeatedly avoided implicating Israel in its genocidal assault on Gaza. Countless headlines have described Palestinians as merely dying, and when the word killed is used, it's rarely made clear who did the killing. It's one of the many ways that Western journalists can dehumanize Palestinians and downplay both their suffering and the brutality of Israel's onslaught. But on Tuesday, BBC News published an article with perhaps the most misleading headline we've seen so far. The lonely death of Gaza man with Down syndrome is how the article was described on Twitter. On the BBC's website, it was Gaza man with Down syndrome dies lonely death. Now, of course, that sounds like an extremely sad story from the description. You might think perhaps he died of natural causes while separated from his family, or maybe he wasn't able to get treatment for an illness. Nothing in that headline prepares you for the horrifying story that follows. The man, Mohammed Bar, was a 24-year-old Palestinian with Down syndrome who lived with his family in Gaza City. According to his mother, Nabila, he wasn't able to feed himself or change his clothes, and he found the war closing in on his family home terrifying. So Nabila told the BBC this: "We were under siege for 7 days. The tanks and soldiers were all around the house. Mohammed was staying on his sofa, and he didn't like sitting anywhere except for there. He would panic and say, 'I'm scared, scared.' He would say, 'Hey, hey,' thinking that someone wanted to hit him. He was always scared, fearful. We would come around him, comfort him. He didn't understand much." Now, according to Mohammed's family, the IDF finally raided their home on July the 3rd. Nabila reported that several dozen soldiers with a combat dog broke through into the house, smashing everything. She says she tried to tell the soldiers that Mohammed was disabled and asked them to keep the dog away from him. Instead, it attacked him. This is Nabila's description of the mauling. The dog attacked him, biting his chest and then his hand. Mohammed didn't speak, only muttering, "No, no, no." The dog bit his arm and the blood was shed. I wanted to get to him, but I couldn't. No one could get to him. And he was patting the dog's head, saying, "Enough, my dear, enough." In the end, he relaxed his hand, and the dog started tearing at him while he was bleeding. The soldiers then separated Mohammed from his family. Nabila's story goes on. They took him away, put him in a separate room and locked the door. We wanted to see what happened to him. We wanted to see Mohammed, to see what had become of him. They told us to be quiet and aimed their guns at us. They put us in a room by ourselves and Mohammed was alone in another room. They said, "We will bring a military doctor to treat him." A doctor did arrive, but Mohammed's family were still kept away from him. After several hours, the family say they were ordered by gunpoint to leave the house, leaving Mohammed behind with the soldiers. They protested, and 2 of his brothers were arrested by the Israelis. They still haven't been released. The rest of the family found shelter in a nearby bombed building, but were only able to return to the house a week later. On their return, they captured video of what they found and subsequently showed the BBC, who described it like this. Mohammed's body is lying on the floor. There is blood around him and a tourniquet on his arm. This was most probably used to stop heavy bleeding from his upper arm. Jibril points to gauze used to bandage a wound and remarks on the blood that clotted after the tourniquet was applied. Jibril is Mohammed's brother, who took the video. He told the BBC this: "They were trying to stop the bleeding. Then they left him without stitches or care, just these basic first aid measures. Of course, as you can see, Mohammed was dead for a period of time already because he was abandoned. We thought he wasn't at home, but it turned out he had been bleeding and left alone at home all this time. Of course, the army left him." Mohammed's family have no idea what happened to him between the moment they were forced to leave and their return to the house a week later. According to Middle East Eye, the family contacted the Red Crescent daily for a week, asking after Mohammed and pleading for medical treatment for him. But the Red Crescent reported non-cooperation from the Israeli military, meaning it wasn't safe for them to travel to the house. After the family found Mohammed dead, there was no post-mortem and no death certificate for the young man. The family was forced to bury him in an alley between houses because it was too dangerous to take his body to a mortuary. Mohammed's mother told the BBC this of the final moments she had with her son. "This scene I will never forget. I constantly see the dog tearing at him in his hand and the blood pouring from his hand. It is always in front of my eyes, never leaving me for a moment. We couldn't save him, neither from them nor the dog. The BBC was right, that is a lonely death. But more importantly, it was the violent and horrific killing of Mohammed by an IDF dog. And it was a death steeped in the inhumanity of Israeli treatment of Palestinians. Soldiers here left a disabled man to die of those injuries alone and presumably terrified. Now, none of that was clear from the BBC's headline, and that downplaying of the harrowing facts of the story led to an outcry on social media. Hours later, the BBC changed its headline to this: Gaza man with Down syndrome attacked by IDF dog and left to die, mother tells BBC. So that is more accurate. The question is why they didn't just start with that. Helena, this headline, I suppose the BBC will say that we've written this powerful story, but it is very much undermined by putting a sort of ridiculously misleading headline above the story.
I mean, I think we're all very used at this point to the continual usage of passive voice when it comes to the casualties in Gaza. Like, Gazans aren't killed by the IDF; they die as part of a conflict, for example. Yet the other way around, when people die in Israel, they have been killed by the Al-Qassam brigades, for example. They don't ever equivocate between these two things, and they use passive voice with regards to the actions of the Israeli military a lot of the time, and it tends to, obviously, as you've seen, publicly obscure the reality of what's happening here. Lots of people would just read the headline and not look into the article. But at least with the BBC, they actually report on some of the things that the IDF do, whereas there are plenty of media outlets in this country who will refuse to even engage in proper scrutiny of the actions of the IDF and the actions of the State of Israel because they're our geopolitical allies. Do we ever hold them to task over the inhumane treatment of people in internment camps in South Israel, people who've been taken on suspicions, for example, of being members of the Al-Qassam brigades, and the ways in which they've been treated? The Novara media have covered this quite a lot, in kind of the inhumane treatment of essentially prisoners of war in southern Israel at the time, or indeed proper reporting and proper scrutiny of the kind of crimes that we've seen in the West Bank for decades and decades. These things get covered up. There is no proper discussion of the ways in which our geopolitical allies have engaged in completely inhumane and degrading treatment of people of Palestine. We've seen, for example, IDF soldiers taking TikToks, ruffling through the underwear drawers of Palestinian women whose houses that they've been dispossessed of through the assault of the IDF in Gaza, posting having what we'd reported on previously, a sympathetic Haaretz article about IDF soldiers living in dispossessed Palestinian people's houses and eating their food as if this is just something that's normal and natural, rather than the result of a brutal military occupation. And again, this is constant throughout loads of areas of the Western press, for example, where they refuse to properly scrutinize the real kind of degrading acts of the Israeli military, because, as Oliver Dowden mentioned on Laura Kuenssberg all of those months ago, they're part of our Western family. Therefore, actual proper scrutiny that is deserved is completely whitewashed within our geopolitical interests. Otherwise, we would see what the result of ethno-nationalist ideology can lead to: people dehumanizing those they occupy.